So thank you, everyone. It's a little bit after 1 o'clock now. We may have some more people join us, but it's great to welcome you here online for our Retrofit talk as part of the Retrofit 24 programme at the Building Centre. I'm Laura Broderick. I've been working on the Retrofit 24 programme and will be facilitating today's event and discussion. Delighted that we are going to be learning about Civic House today, a retrofit project in Glasgow that is also one of our case studies in the Retrofit 24 exhibition. So it will be great to take a deep dive into this and have an architect and client presentation all about the process and the results of that fantastic retrofit. We will be hearing from Chris Stewart of Collective Architecture. Chris is an architect and a passive house designer. We'll also be hearing from Rob Morisson, Director of Agile City, who oversaw the development of Civic House and is very much about creating a retrofit campus in the north area of Glasgow. So it'll be fantastic to learn more and hear from them together. Before I pass over to them to give the presentations, just a little bit about the Retrofit 24 series and the Retrofit 24 Talks programme. This is actually our first webinar of this series, though we do have many great events, panel discussions and building tours. So check out the Building Centre's website to find out more. The exhibition is all about the reuse agenda for our commercial, cultural and civic buildings. And I very much believe Civic House in Glasgow covers all three of those functions in ethos and form and function. So it would be great to kind of hear more today. The webinar will be till about 1:30 in terms of presentations from Chris and Rob, and then we'll open it up to questions from you, our attendees. As this is a webinar format, that will be through the chat function. You should be able to see a Q&A box. So please do use that to leave your questions. If you specifically want to address Rob or Chris, please make that clear in your typed question. And I will try and get through as many of those with them once they've finished at round about 1:30, and we'll aim to finish at 1:45. So that's the format today. Yeah, just encourage you to look at further events. Today is being recorded as well. So if you do enjoy what you see and hear today, it will be up on our YouTube channel shortly. And you can share that with your colleagues and others that you think would benefit from hearing about this retrofit example. So I think that's it from me. I will ask Rob and Chris to both turn their cameras on, and I will hand over to them and see you for the Q&A. So thanks again for attending.
All right, thanks very much, Laura. I'm going to kick us off, but very quickly I'm going to pass you straight over to Rob. But as Laura said, I'm Chris Stewart. I'm one of the founding directors at Collective Architecture, and I happen to also be the current president of the Royal Corporation of Architects in Scotland. But I am standing in for Emily, who was the project architect, but well, is the project, or still is the project architect, but is on parental leave at the moment because she happily had a baby child at the weekend. So she's got a baby boy, Caden, so she couldn't make it along. But first of all, I now am a passive house designer, so I will answer some little, well, I'll speak a little bit about some of the technical stuff in the middle of the presentation, but the vast majority of it, which I'm happy to say, will be by Rob, and I will introduce to Rob Morisson, who's the founder of Agile City, and very much the driving force and the inspiration behind Civic House. I can see him kind of blushing a little bit there. And now we kind of come to what probably the most difficult part of this whole project for me, or this whole presentation, is I'm now going to try and screen share. So I've got the job of screen sharing. So you will hear a lot of next slide from Rob and things like that, but I'm going to pass you immediately over to him. So I'm now going to try and screen share. Here we go. Is that working?
Success.
Right, now I'm just going to try and make this. Right, here we go. Okay, so over to you, Rob.
Nice, thanks, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Rob Morisson. I'm director of Agile City, which is a community interest company based in North Glasgow. Next slide, please, Chris. So as a social enterprise, we've got three core objectives, which I think is important to run through because it sets the context of this project and the sort of ethos behind it. So the first one being creating a high quality workspace for a community of people working across cultural, social enterprise and green enterprise. We host an events program to build community of people and to spark collaboration. And very linked to this project, Civic House, is our ambition is to initiate ambitious projects to test how buildings, spaces and cities are produced in more equitable ways, and in so doing contribute to the regeneration of our local area. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Chris. So for those whom aren't familiar with Glasgow, it's I thought it'd be useful to give context to the project and the city, because ultimately the location that we find the project in has informed the genesis of the project and also its ongoing regeneration and ultimately the objectives of Agile City, where an organisation has been founded in a specific part of Glasgow, and our work has responded to that context. So as you can see, there's the arrow there points to Civic House. To the right of where the building is the Firth Canal, and so that canal runs in this instance going north and west, but it used to connect Edinburgh and Glasgow. So a huge amount of goods that effectively initiated the development of the area as a really high density industrial activity. And then to the south of the building, you can see the M8 motorway, which effectively severs the city centre and the north of the city. That was built in the 60s, which I'll come back to in a second. So it really is an area that has been following the building of those pieces of infrastructure has really impacted its development over the last 100 years. Next slide, please, Chris. So this is in a plan view. So to the south, you can see the city centre, really tight urban fabric. And then as you go further north, you can start to see vast areas of greenland and also brownfield sites where there has been a lot of the industry over the years has been demolished. And next slide, please, Chris. Yeah, so you can see in this slide, this is taken early 1900s. So to the east, you can see the really tight urban fabric of predominantly tenement buildings. The arrow there points to Civic House, and then to the right of the image is where the canal is. So this really showed at one point, excuse me, in the early 1900s, this area of Glasgow was one of the most densely populated areas of Western Europe. And that was predominantly due to the fact that people lived very close to the industries in which they worked. And then over the years, with deindustrialization of this part of the city and then the construction of the motorway, that's had a significant impact on how the city has developed. Next slide, please. So again, the white arrow shows where Civic House is, and this photo looks east along the city. So this isn't like a war zone. This is like the construction of the M8 motorway in the 1960s. So a vast amount of the city was demolished to create space for this huge piece of transport infrastructure. And as we go through these slides, we can then start to see the impact that's had over in terms of just flattening a massive part of the city. Next, please. So this is another image. Next one again, please. So this is the motorway starting being built. You can see Civic House top left in that photo. If anyone is interested, this is an amazing archive. So it's Glasgow Motorway Archive, and it's some incredible images of the building process. Next one, please. Next one. So yeah, so this is after construction. So you can see Civic House just the lower part of that photo, and to the right of that image is the land we were looking onto for a very long time, which is like completely cleared of all the housing that once existed. And then on the left-hand side is the city centre. So you can see that the challenges that the city has been grappling with, which is massive issues of vacant and derelict land, and trying to work out how to restitch the north of the city with the city centre, which has caused significant economic and social challenges. And so ultimately, this is the genesis of the Civic House project, which is, and in early 2000s, there was a partnership developed by Glasgow City Council, Scottish Canals, and Igloo Regeneration, and that was established to try and regenerate the north of the city, and utilize the canal as the main asset that would help to facilitate that, bringing to life a lot of the industrial buildings that exist around the canal, like many areas around the UK and Europe, to think about it as a vehicle for regeneration. Next slide, please. So yeah, so this is present day. So you can see again, like even now, there is still huge amounts of green and brown space. This is like, from the bottom of that slide is the city centre, and to like maybe walking north where the arrow is, maybe about 5-10 minute walk. So we're talking a huge amount of vacant and derelict land, very, very close to the city centre. Next slide, please. So yeah, that was the context. So basically in 2017, Agile City was awarded money from Scottish government to acquire the building. If you go to the next slide. And the next one, please. Yeah, so to acquire the building and to regenerate it as a social space that would have 3 primary functions. One would be a canteen, a venue, and a co-working space. And that was, when we first started the project, we didn't really have a clear understanding of like the format that would become, or necessarily the brief. But ultimately, we wanted to learn from the building to find out what it could become and the people who would wish to inhabit it. So the building itself was built in 1920 as Civic Press Limited. If we can go through the next one. And this was what it was like in maybe 70s, 80s. So it had become very derelict. And again, still the land in front of the building and surrounding it was still very much vacant. And there's a huge amount of issues in terms of antisocial behaviour that we experienced when we took it on. Next one, please. Yeah, so you can just go through these, Chris. These were just some photos of the interior, just to understand what historically it got used for as a printing press. So this was the first floor. This is the ground floor, a huge amount of, this is where all the printing was happening. And so that's to give context to what it's like now. So when we first took it on, we took on a building and we had very, very little understanding of what its potential was. We were very fortunate to receive the funding, and that funding had to be spent locally within the area around the canal. And so Civic House was available, and we knew that we wanted to acquire a building because we were concerned of issues of gentrification that other organisations like ours have experienced in other parts of the country. And so to own the building that we occupied and developed was really, really important to us. So we acquired the building and then slowly went through a process of stripping it back and fundamentally just learning about what the building was, what its assets were, and what it could become. And for anyone who's gone through this process with these types of buildings, it was a really interesting one in the sense that almost every layer that we peeled back had about 2 or 3 layers behind it of just where people had just, rather than dealt with the problems that further in the construction, they were just like layering on top to try and conceal. Next one, please. And then, yeah, so slowly we discovered this amazing space started to reveal itself to us. We were really fortunate that we didn't discover anything too bad. There were some issues with rot, but nothing that wasn't that we couldn't overcome. And yeah, and next one, please, Chris. And so this space then was stripped back. We again peeling back the layers, discovering lovely terrazzo in the foyer. Next one, please. And then this is what the first floor space then became. So we were really fortunate that the building was, all the materials that we discovered were of really high quality, really lovely tactile sort of finishes. And this really informed the approach that we took to the retrofit, which is that a lot of questions that we get asked is around where do you insulate and where do you put your thermal line within the building. And for us, it was really sort of, we wanted to, the real quality of the space was the interior. and due to the huge number of windows that were embedded within the design of it as a print press, and that so in the design and the retrofit project, we wanted to make sure that we retained the material tactility, but also ultimately allowed the building to express itself in terms of its structure and its construction, so that as people were in it, they understood the nature of the space and the original building, plus and making a very clear distinction between what was the original building and then what are the new interventions and the retrofit measures that we introduced. Next, please, Chris. Yeah, so and I just wanted to speak briefly about, I guess, retrofit as a process, and it's one that I've been learning, I personally and as an organization, we've been learning a great deal about over the last 5 years. I think it takes quite maybe a different approach, perhaps, than a typical architecture brief, in the sense that it is often durational. And in our instance, we had to do it in a phased approach. We had to do it in a way that was phased in response to the funding that we were awarded. Like, I'm not sure, it might be different in different parts of the country, but like where we are in Glasgow and in Scotland, often funding isn't all awarded at once. And so you either have to fundraise over a very long period of time until you get all the money in the bank, or you phase one's project to allow work to start and you do work to the building as money becomes available. And we opted for the latter because we really wanted to start with action and for people to engage people, to seek input and to try and implement that feedback as quickly as possible so people could actively see change happening every time they came into the space. And for us, the main route for doing that was really setting up the kitchen. Food is the universal connector, and like for us, it was like super important to sort of embed food and the kitchen space at the heart of this project. And we with the first tranche of funding that we got, the first phase was strip out the building to understand the space, and the second, any money that we had left, we invested in the kitchen. And really, that was a very, very important thing for us because by investing in the kitchen, it meant that we could invite people into the space. It's sharing drink and sharing food is very convivial, and through that, conversations evolved into to understand ultimately who were the audience who wanted to engage with the building and with us, and what are their needs in regards to what spaces are needed by that community of people. For anyone on this call who've like written a business plan, well, my experience is any business plan that you write is highly speculative, and all the people that you say that you might engage or the money that you might make is a very sort of like abstract guess a lot of the time. And actually, until you start opening the door and starting to run the business, you don't actually know the answer to those questions. So for us, it's about an iterative design process that allowed us to evolve the building and the brief to suit the needs of the community that we were trying to serve. Yeah, so next slide, please. And that, I think that so after we had an initial, we used the building for the initial 2 years or a year and a half, roughly. The kitchen was operational for a year before COVID. And during that period, we were speaking to people a lot. We were delivering summer schools, we were delivering workshops and engagement events, and speaking to people about what it was that was special about the space and what was lacking in Glasgow for the people that we wanted to connect with. And ultimately, the thing that we kept on coming back to was the idea of like people who were in similar positions to us were really struggling with how to retrofit these buildings to become less of a liability. And by liability, what I mean is that often these post-industrial buildings are prohibitively expensive to run, and especially with what happened with the energy crisis and the energy bills increasing dramatically. So often in Glasgow and often in other parts of the UK, it's like either cultural, social, or arts organisations who inhabit these types of buildings. And what's super important is we start to learn how they can become assets rather than liabilities. And for us, it was this idea of like how to use this building to create a prototype of how post-industrial spaces can become energy positive. What's so important there is this idea that these buildings can become like micro power stations. And this is the vision we set out. So the vision was to create a micro power station of energy and ideas to help drive Scotland's journey to net zero. That was our sort of like, that's the thing that kind of helped us articulate what that vision would become. And off this, the photo in this slide is actually Pinkston Power Station, which is a 5-minute walk behind Civic House, and this was demolished in the 50s. But what's the contemporary version of this? And that comes through renewable energy. And Chris, next slide, please. So yeah, this slide here is the sort of like that's where this is when we started working with collective architecture on this brief, which is the idea of a micro power station and the idea of a post-industrial building becoming a prototype for others. And so ultimately, by approaching it through a passive house methodology, that gives us a framework for dramatically enhancing the thermal performance, and then utilizing the vast amount of roof space that we have. We install power. We generate power via solar panels, PV. And then we start looking at how that energy can be used in productive ways, both inside the building and outside the building, using, we're obviously right next to the M8 motorway, so with a vast amount of traffic, so generating revenue via EV charging is a logic that we're pursuing just now. And I think the next slide is over to you, Chris. Is it? We go? Yeah, we are.
Yeah, it is me.
Yeah.
Over to me for just a wee bit about the technical stuff. I mean, one point, a great point that we were talking about the other day is Rob's now exporting electricity, albeit at a very reduced tariff. So the building is already achieving what Rob was aiming to do. But a wee bit about us. I mean, this was actually a collective energy project. So we have a specialist division in collective architecture. It has a few specialists in it, passive house designers, energy consultants. So we kind of took it on. And the reason I think Rob knew about us, but one of the reasons Rob knew about us more so was that we did have 2 projects just in close proximity to Rob, and that was our refurbishment of the high-rise blocks in Woodside, very close, which we brought up to Enerfit, almost Enerfit kind of standard. And we've just completed the one at the back, just where that Pinkston Power Station was, which is Scotland's biggest passive house project. So we've just completed that. And so we kind of knew we were working in the area. So when we were delighted, of course, that Rob asked us to get on board. So we started looking at it, and we worked with Rob, who had a very great understanding of the way the building works. And I think it's amazing, this idea of, I mean, we have huge conversations about this at the Royal Corporation of Architects of Scotland, is that, you know, Rob has used, or together we've used external wall insulation to overclad the building, but what it does do is perhaps a lot of arguments that might then start to conceal the historic fabric of the building, especially if it's maybe stone or whatever. But in this case, I think the facades actually reflect what was kind of there previously. But what is brilliant is the fact that you can actually open up a whole new world on the inside, and you can see all this magnificent kind of finishes that Rob showed kind of earlier on. But this is how it's achieved, but by creating this thermal envelope around the whole building, albeit that we didn't get as far as Enerfit, basically because we couldn't insulate. Well, we could insulate, you can do anything you like, but we couldn't insulate the ground floor, which was solid concrete floor, and to obviously dig that up and get insulation underneath it would be a bit of madness in terms of embodied carbon and the work. But also the concrete floor gave an incredible kind of base for the work that Rob does, and there's also a solid concrete floor. So a big amazing part of what Rob's done is this building is very flexible, so the walls that kind of do go in can get moved around, and if Rob chooses to remodel the building in a very kind of deconstruction kind of like reassembly manner. But there's the plans, and that red line, those are familiar with Passive House, that kind of shows you where the air tightness line is and where we're putting the bulk of the kind of insulation. There's some photographs of the insulation going in. So there's a big, I think it's 150, 200 mil of external wall insulation going in the outside, and obviously getting hard into those jambs. to avoid any kind of cold bridging. Done obviously in PassiveWareHaus, so you can see that the gaps between are less than 5 millimeters, and those gaps have actually already been infilled with foam. So there's no gaps at all in this insulation. And there's just a better kind of clearer look at that, and you can see where that insulation kind of sits. So it goes all the way around. All the cold bridges are dealt with, as you can see there, and it goes hard into the jambs. And apart from the ground floor, of course, as we just described. So it's thermal bridge free and as airtight as we can get it. And we did test it. So we brought along our kind of in-house kind of fan, and we put smoke in it. And what we did, I mean, 1 air change per hour is what you would look for anything. We didn't quite get that with the 1.75 air changes per hour, which is pretty damn good. And then you can see the results there. And I think a lot of that down was to you taping the windows yourself, Rob, getting in there and getting that tape around, and making sure that they're all kind of worked in. So because that was probably the biggest part of the work, was around the windows, and the windows and doors, they are triple glazed. So as Rob says, when do you invest your money? When do you invest your money when you do it? So the big investment was in the external envelope and making sure that was as insulated as we possibly could. And also there was a good investment into PassiveWareHaus performance windows that went in, which are triple glazed, and they look magnificent as well. So that you can see they're kind of going in there. And you can see how they're going to be fit more to the external face of the window of the insulation. And then the efficient service. So there's mechanical ventilation heat recovery, as you would expect in an Retrofit style project. And that was kept very, very kind of compact and very, very efficient. And there you can see the MVHR itself. But all of that, we ran the PHPP with a PassiveWareHaus planning package, and so we would run that through, and when it was existing, you can see there how we're performing. You can see the big kind of red bit there, which tells you how we are doing in terms of space heating demand. But what we were able to achieve was an 87% reduction in space heating demand, which is pretty phenomenal. And especially when you consider that the ground floor isn't actually insulated, so that's amazing. And then that subsequently with the renewable energy, that gives the building the opportunity to become an energy provider rather than an energy taker, which I think is just fantastic. And that is my short bit over, I'm afraid, Rob. It's back to you to tell a little bit about the building and all the uses you've got and where you're going with it now.
Thank you. So yeah, these are some photos from various open days that we've had. We do and hosting part of a Fringe festival for COP, and the building now is incredibly versatile because, as Chris mentioned, we're very lucky that the main floor plan is completely flexible, so we're able to adapt it to suit different needs, and it really has, I think, delivered against what we had hoped to achieve. In the sense, I think, just in our first year of operation, we've been measuring the consumption of the energy that we use versus the production very closely, and we've now, in the first year of operation, we produced twice as much energy as we consumed. So that gives a sense of, by lowering the energy demand through the heating, and generating power, I think that really is sort of like the kind of, yeah, I think when you start these projects, you see the models and you don't really know if you can trust them ultimately, because there's one thing about doing it through a software platform, and there's another thing about its operation. And I think that's been incredibly sort of empowering for us in terms of thinking about the next steps. And those next steps include retrofitting our second building called Glue Factory, and also then looking at, we've just taken on a lease outside of the spaces outside Civic House, to thinking about we're creating a hub for sustainable city development. And ultimately, I think the big thing for us is then starting to take these projects and start sharing them, like through formats like this, or giving tours So it's just, and even locally, we're looking now at how the model of applying retrofit measures to buildings in the local area and generating power through PV, we can start thinking about local energy networks around the canal, which I think would be massively advantageous for a lot of the organizations whom we work closely with. I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious, and we've been given very strict instructions to stop talking at 1:30, so I'll stop talking and then hopefully you can time for questions.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Rob. You're only a little bit over 1:30, so you've done really well. So thank you for that. It's a fantastic example, and it's great to kind of hear the story of how you work together. And we do have some questions coming in the chat function. They're quite technical, so I'll start with a broader question, and then hopefully others who are listening can add their questions into the Q&A, and then we'll get to as many of those as we can before 1:45. So Rob, Chris, I'm kind of interested in the dynamic of architects and clients working together on these retrofit briefs, which are quite complicated, in some ways quite experimental as per each specific need of each building. And you mentioned, Rob, partly through the funding, it had to be a sort of evolving brief.
Yeah.
So any lessons learned for people who are in similar positions about how to manage that program, or how to keep momentum, or for want of a better word, keep the energy?
It's a real challenge. I think I was actually speaking to someone from a housing association this morning about retrofitting some of their houses in their portfolio, and the challenge we had was trying to retrofit a building while being potentially still occupied, and because we still need to make money ultimately, and so it's a really, really tricky situation, and I think that's why insulating from the outside definitely helps, and that was one of the reasons why we approached it in that way. But I think ultimately I guess it's a more an expanded approach to how an architecture brief would be developed. And I studied architecture. I don't practice architecture now, but I studied it. So I think it was a very kind of like collaborative discussion with Emily and Rupert from Collective Architecture when the project started, is really thinking, what are these different measures that we can introduce, and the phasing and the staging of which they could be done. And ultimately, you don't always know how the funding that you get and the works that are needed to be done can line up. We were very fortunate that all the money arrived, but sometimes that doesn't happen. So you have to try and figure out a way that you can do work with the money that you have that doesn't then render the project like unusable. So I think it does take quite a long time, and I think like my like trying to marry the funding objectives and understand the funding landscape alongside the architectural potential in terms of like the feasibility of that is an essential task, and a challenging one, but I think also a good challenge.
I mean, from an architect point of view, I mean, I think it's a brilliant example of Rob's and how we actually do things in an incremental manner. I mean, that's I mean, it's more challenging for us with other clients, which are often local authorities, but we do have to kind of introduce them to the idea of incremental retrofit in that we do things sequentially, but just as long as we do them sequentially in a certain way that doesn't then prevent something happening in the future. So we're not going through abortive works, or they're done in such a way that perhaps things which sometimes it might be 30,000 houses we look at, which is like for our North Lanarkshire Council, and we have to then think about how they for instance, they've just double glazed all their whole bundle of buildings, but they're not necessarily going to rip all that double glazing out to then stick in triple glazing, because it's got a massive lifespan still there. But it's just then, how do we then overclad the building so we don't actually do the jams being left off, so they can then take those windows out in the future, put the triple glazing back in perhaps 5 years time. And so it's just, and this kind of incremental thinking is actually finding its way into everything we do, just even the way we urban plan. Okay, I'm going to start talking about Patrick Geddes again here in a minute, I think. But so we're going off on a complete tangent there. So bring it back to retrofit. But yeah, incrementally, how you actually approach these buildings is crucial.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. So I'll go to the questions that are in the chat function. As I say, please feel free to type those in. So a question for you, Chris, from Nabila. Such a great project. How did you measure 87% efficiency if the building was not occupied? Sorry, I can't remember your exact slide on that. So are you happy to elaborate on that, Chris?
Yeah, well, of course, that's a big factor in it. I didn't do those calculations, but of course, people give off a lot of heat, and that does get factored into the PHPP packages. And of course, the number of people that will be in there will vary as well. So I don't know exactly how they calculated those, but they would probably have made assumptions of some sort. But it looks to me that it was probably inhabited a lot more than perhaps they would. So that, if anything, that might have improved it. In the fact that you know, if it's calculated without people in it who give off heat, and then it's subsequently calculated with people in it, it will probably improve. Not the best answer, I'm sorry about that.
No, it's a tricky question, Nabila. Yeah. Okay. No, but all that collection of data and how you use that and process that is very important. And we've actually got an event. It will be held in person at the London Building Centre on Thursday evening, all about data and retrofit projects. So that will be recorded. So anyone who can't come in person, we will have that on our YouTube channel as well shortly afterwards. So yeah, just thinking about how you get the facts. Next question is from Oliver Watson. I think this is probably for you as well, Chris. Did you review insulating above the slab and raising the finished floor level? I assume that's to do with the ground floor.
I suspect not. And well, it probably was considered, and Rob will probably historically know better than me. But to start raising the floor and again, there might have been some good ideas that could have been had there in terms of underfloor heating and whatever, to get it into that kind of part there. But I think it would have lifted the floor up a bit, and then started to cause us trouble with door lintels and heights and window heights and access points and things like that, because we would have to prig it up, and then we would have wanted a solid floor on top of that again. So perhaps if you had like a 100 insulation or 150, or then perhaps like another 50, 60 screed on top of that, which might have had underfloor insulation in it. It would have just taken us a bit high. So I bet it was thought about at the start of the project. But usually those are the reasons why we find that quite difficult. It is achievable at times, and to tell you the truth, there's steps up to the building, so it might have been, and the existing staircase, which was also retained, would also have been quite difficult. But I suppose you could have made it one riser height and work within that kind of those parameters. But I guess it was considered, Rob, but it was probably ruled out because it's just such a great solid kind of floor. Do you recall, Rob?
Yeah, it was. I think we get asked this quite a lot, actually, in regards to certification and what stage the project's at. And it's an interesting one, because when you start, like, it comes back to the previous question as well, in terms of like how heating demand is measured. And but the slide that Chris showed was a projection pre and post in terms of heating demand based on the measures. And I think from my experience, it's like there's a massive difference between what can be projected through the operational needs. Like, for example, when you have deliveries and someone leaves the door open for 3 hours, it kind of like, you don't model for that. And so, like, ultimately we didn't want to make the final interventions until we've operated the building sufficiently and learned from the occupants and use about where efficiencies are best placed. Because it gets to the point when you're at the moment, our heating bills are lower than some people's flats than we work with. So it's like we've got an 800 square meter building,
yeah.
And like, so when you start thinking about marginal gains in terms of investment versus and you have to marry those gains between operational carbon and embodied carbon for us to go in and insulate the whole of the ground floor. Like, at what are the gains that you aim to achieve in regards to energy reduction and carbon emissions versus the costs of doing that and the embedded or embodied carbon within the materials one might use.
Yeah.
And so I think that's it. I think ultimately it comes back to the airflow. When we did the air test, what that told us is that we were doing really well comparatively to what the building was. but we've got, I think Emily kind of drew it out for me, but like, the amount of air gaps that we had in the building when it was tested was about the size of an A3 piece of paper, comparative to before, like a massive, it was just like there was holes literally all over because those buildings were just ventilated by natural airflow. So it's, again, with the air tightness, you then can start saying, we know that there's areas that we need to improve on the air tightness in terms of doors and openings and like how the building's used. And so I think it's like, architecture, in my opinion, is done best when design, going back to this word incremental, is done on an incremental basis through an observation of actual use of inhabitants. Like, so for example, like how does a canteen want to use the building? How does guests to a venue want to use the building? How do the co-workers want to use the building? They all have different use profiles.
Yeah.
So ultimately, whether we decide to insulate the floor or whether we decide to improve our air tightness, or whether we decide to install electric batteries or EV chargers or a whole host of other measures, those are all things that we can do, but I think have to be based on use case examples and fundamentally how do we create the most amount of value for the people who use the space rather than another set of factors. I think that's kind of where that's, and just the final thing, I think what's valuable from our perspective is that we both have been involved in the design process, but we're also occupying the building every day as an organization. So it's not like with an architecture project, obviously, often architects will hand it over to the client and then not necessarily be fully aware of how the building's used. From our perspective,
tenant,
we're constantly reviewing the building and then having an ongoing dialogue with collective architecture and others about how we can improve the design. And I think that's also this idea of like a design process that is both incremental and durational. So we can observe, test, and build in quite quick cycles, and that's kind of the foundation of where Agile City. That's where the name comes from. That's where our sort of like our methodology is sort of founded in, and that's how we've enjoyed working. It has challenges.
It's super interesting. Coming up to the end, but just very quickly, obviously to achieve things like that air tightness, working with contractors as well and specifying like, how did you find that process? Because obviously it's not just architect and client relationship, there's a whole, say the good things. Like,
I'll go first and I'll let Rob have the last word, because I wasn't involved in the on-site build, but a big part of what I do is I do inductions to contractors in PassiveWareHaus, and so I go up and introduce them to the spirit of the whole notion of working together, but also which is a big thing, because even in the mental health of contractors working in passive projects is actually better than other projects are kind of improving, but that kind of collaborative process. But we talk it through and we show people how you tape the windows, how you actually like where it's important things, the sequencing of the work, and how we aren't going to damage these membranes. So there's a big part of it, that kind of induction process. And I know Rob was probably inducting himself, so I'll ask him to then he can now tell you about physically what happened in Civic House itself. So, which I think you did a lot of the taping yourself, did you not, Rob?
No, I can't take credit for all of it. I did some. It's
a lot of windows, yeah.
A lot of windows. Just I guess very briefly, we approached this as, rather than going through a main contractor, we went to individual contractors for all the different elements: the roof, external wall insulation, windows, MVHR, solar panels. And my job was to coordinate between those people.
Okay.
And so that we took that decision because we wanted to speak directly to the people who had specific expertise. So rather than having all the communication going via a main contractor and then going out to the subcontractors, exactly what Chris is saying is that like we wanted to be able to speak very, very directly to the person who is actually going to install it. And that involved, Rupert Daly, who started the project with Collective Architecture, was doing those inductions around like cold bridging, and then thinking about all the interfaces. But that ultimately was a really big challenge. Like I underestimated the amount of work involved dramatically, but I think ultimately I learned a lot from it. And I think if for other people going on a similar type of process with a similar type of building, I think it will depend on the capacity of the organization and the individuals leading it. But it was a really interesting process because it meant that you could catch problems much quicker rather than layers of communication where often mistakes are made. But yeah, I could talk about that for a long time, so I'll stop.
Save that for seminar, webinar part 2. Okay.
Yeah.
But thank you both. It's after 1:45, so I think we should draw to a close. But thank you for your presentations. It's great to have you talking together about Civic House. For anyone attending, we'll try and get the recording up on YouTube as quickly as possible. And if you can make it to London for our in-person events, that would be wonderful. Obviously, the exhibition Retrofit 24 is on through the summer as well, through to the end of August. So please do come and visit us and keep involved in the programme. So yeah, thank you again. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rob. And take care, everyone.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thanks.